Good afternoon, everyone. This is Beth Wadham. I'm from the Association for Contemplative Mind in Higher Education, and welcome to our September webinar, Cultivating the Executive Mind. Is mindfulness the key to 21st century economic survival? And we're here today with Jeremy Hunter. Since 1999, Jeremy has been with the Peter F. Drucker School of Management in Claremont, California. He now teaches in the Executive Management and MBA programs, and he's been voted Professor of the Year for 3 years by students in both courses. He has advanced degrees from the University of Chicago and the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard, and a BA in East Asian Studies from Wittenberg University. Jeremy's courses, The Practice of Self-Management and The Executive Mind, are among the first to introduce mindfulness practice, attention training, and emotional management into management school contexts. They incorporate recent findings in neuroscience, psychology, medicine, and the arts. His own contemplative practice, for more than 20 years, has been under the guidance of Mirabai Bush, Shinsen Young, Graham White, Lynn Bousfield, Dr. Tin Tin, and Ken McLeod. On a personal note, his practice and his teaching is informed by living day to day for 17 years with a potentially terminal illness. He's had an experience of the profound generosity of others. When faced with the need for life-saving surgery, more than a dozen of his former students came forward as organ donors. Jeremy has an active international consulting practice and works with a wide range of clients, including manufacturers, financial organizations, consumer products, defense contractors, hospitals, universities, cultural institutions, governments, and nonprofit entities. Wow. Well, thank you so much, Jeremy, for offering this webinar to this Contemplative Mind Network. And now I'll hand over the presentation to you.
Thanks, everyone. I think Drucker thought of himself as a social philosopher, and what he was primarily interested in was what did it mean to have a functioning society. And he understood that modern societies were comprised of organizations, and then for that society to work well, those organizations had to work well. And for those organizations to work well, they had to be managed well. So his interest in management was really about an interest in society. So at the Drucker School, our students are, of course, people from private industry, but they're from all over, many different sectors, healthcare, nonprofit. We have one of the best arts management programs in the country. And so my students can be people who are entrepreneurs, who are oftentimes senior executives in large firms. They are also scientists, and the fellow who's in charge of managing the team at Jet Propulsion Laboratory that calculates the navigational path of space probes through the solar system was a student of mine. We have quite a variety of very interesting folks. And also next door is the Drucker Institute, which is charged with preserving and sharing the legacy of Peter Drucker. So there are a lot of interesting things going on in Claremont, and I encourage everybody to come visit. If you want to know more about Peter Drucker, there are 3 recent books that have just been published. One is Joe Massarello and Karen Linkletter's book, Drucker's Lost Art of Management, which talks about the relationship of, or the idea of Drucker, that Drucker had about management as a liberal art. And another book which was published last year, edited by the executive director of the Drucker Institute, Rick Wartzman, is the Drucker Lectures. And they're a fantastic collection of some of his best speeches. And then in 2009, we published The Drucker Difference, which was a collaborative effort by the faculty. If you want to know more about the material I'm talking about today, the chapter I co-authored with Scott Shearer is unfortunately chapter 11, which I hope isn't foretelling something about my financial future, but that's all right. So anyway, chapter 11 of the Drucker Difference is a place you might want to go. Let me say a little bit about my courses. I teach in the Executive Management program, and as Beth mentioned, about a decade ago, I developed a series of courses called The Executive Mind. They produced several sequels. The first one is 7 weeks focusing primarily on cultivating attention, and we're going to talk a little bit about that today. The next 7 weeks focuses on mastering emotional reactions, and the third 7 weeks focuses on managing transitions and moving forward. You know, many of our students are in one form of transition or another, and all of these courses use mindfulness as their basis for working. So you can come to the Drucker School and get 21 weeks of mindfulness training that is geared primarily to the life of the executive. And in the MBA program, I teach a class called The Practice of Self-Management, which is a semester-long course that's comprised of the first 2 classes I mentioned above. Let me say a little bit about what the classes aren't. They aren't primarily a therapy group, so we're not there to discuss, you know, childhood issues, even though that's important. It just doesn't have a place, I think, in a management school. And it's also not a religious practice. So I like to joke that there's no hand-holding, no drum beating, no song singing, and you don't ever have to involuntarily hug someone you don't know. What the classes are a set of systematic frameworks and tools that help you understand and better manage your own experience. I like to say I teach right brain skills in a left brain way. And the courses are structured to use your own life as the laboratory. So all the learning is applied immediately. It's not abstract. You start to see your own insights and not, say, the insights of a third person by reading a case study. And as I mentioned, the courses are designed with the life of the busy executive in mind. So it's not organized around being a monastic. It's around how do we bring mindfulness to action so that we can be effective. And they build on a long-time Drucker theme that you can't manage other people unless you manage yourself first. And the focus that the class takes is, you know, how do you manage yourself in the moment? How do you manage your thoughts? How do you manage your emotions? How do you manage your own body or your judgments in the moment as it's happening? So it's a little different, I think, than a lot of leadership courses, which tend to focus on a higher order viewpoint of looking at one's vision and values, which are, of course, important. But the aspect of the moment, I think, gives a greater vitality to the work in a way. Now, about the title. The title is derived from insights that Drucker worked with for over 50 years. And he understood that making knowledge workers productive was one of the biggest 21st century management challenges. And in the next sentence, he talks about the importance of making knowledge workers productive is vital to the survival of developed economies. Well, so let's take a look at this question, what's a knowledge worker? It's a term that Drucker defined over 50 years ago, and it refers to someone who creates or analyzes and shares information and knowledge. And this is contrasted to, say, the manual factory worker, which was the kind of predominant worker of that era, you know, of the 1950s. He was primarily doing repetitive physical tasks. I'm curious to know, well, I'll ask you in a minute, but so now just as a kind of side note, it's also true that there are classes of knowledge workers, like call center employees, that engage largely in repetitive tasks. And in fact, if you want to read a fascinating exploration of the life of a call center employee, there's a book that was just published recently called Dead Ringers, which is a kind of sociological, anthropological analysis of life in an Indian call center, which makes for quite riveting reading, I have to say. And also, today's factory work is much more knowledge intensive than it was in Henry Ford's day. So, there are a couple caveats to this, but in general, knowledge workers, I think, refer to people who research or discover, invent, strategize, innovate, who are creative. They're doctors and designers, they're scientists and social workers, they're executives and engineers. They make up about a third of the working population, but they are the primary engines of economic growth. And, you know, we all know that the most recent growth industries are in places like biotechnology and the internet are highly knowledge intensive. So the other thing is that people who use their minds to make a living don't do it in isolation. They're doing it with other minds. So unlike solitary factory workers stamping out parts, knowledge workers are working quite intensely with other knowledge workers. So I like to say that knowledge workers are also social workers, with quotes. And what this emphasizes is the need for nuanced social and emotional skill. And so that'll have some bearing on what we're going to talk about later. The productivity of knowledge workers versus manual industrial workers is something that's very different. And understanding this difference is something that I think the society has really been struggling with. And in my view, after 10 years of doing this work, I'm not sure we're doing it all that well. So it's important to understand how these two things are different. In knowledge work or industrial work, the primary productive power was that of the machine. And the role that people played was to help the machine do the things it couldn't. I worked in a factory going through college, stamping out door hinges and electroplating them. And I'm curious to know, so here's a question for you all. Is there anybody out there who's worked on a factory line? Okay, here are a few.
Oh yeah, Paul Benson says yes. Yeah.
Richard, what was it? You pulled what? Pulled green chain and lumber mill. Okay, anybody else? Paper cups, Rebecca, paper cups in Baltimore. Okay, Rebecca, what did you do with the paper cups? Polishing doorknobs. I love it. Okay, so there's a few. So you, Anthony, when you polished it, what was actually the job, if you could write out? I'm curious to know, when I worked in this job, I could pull defective ones off the line. Okay, great. Oh, before packaging. That's great. And poured molten stuff, making the inside of the blast furnaces. So that's some serious factory work. That's fantastic. What I noticed in doing this job is when you're working in a factory, you understand exactly what the task is, right? I'm pulling off the defective doorknob, or pulling off defective doorknobs. Oops, where did we go? There we are. I had to take hinges and put them on a giant industrial hanger, which then I had to stick on this machine, which was the size, was the size of half a city block. And you had to put 45 of these things on a hanger, and then stick that hanger on the machine before the machine moved, which was between a minute and 90 seconds. And that was my job. I knew what to do. So the whole thrust of industrial work was to narrow down your attention on one very specific task, right? So I could focus on the job. I knew exactly at the end of the day how well I had done. Maybe I had electroplated 1,000 door hinges that day, right? And again, I was basically by myself. I was doing this for 8 hours a day. I didn't have to have complex discussions or negotiations with anybody, and there were clear time-space boundaries. At the end of the day, I could go home, and I didn't have to think about door hinges unless I had post-traumatic dreams about them or something like that. And the big emotion that we had to deal with, I think, on the factory line was boredom, because you're basically doing the same thing in and out, day in and day out. Now, how is knowledge work different? So the primary asset of knowledge workers are the workers themselves, right? So this is in contrast, again, to the industrialism where the machine was the asset, right? But now in knowledge work, it's you're the asset. And it's both the issue of the knowledge in our head and how we're able to use it, right? And so it's the quality of mind that counts in terms of how we're able to mobilize our knowledge. So if we take a look at qualities of knowledge work, often these are things that my students report. In contrast to working with on a factory line, the tasks are unclear, right? Interruption is the norm. When I'm working on the factory, nobody was texting me, nobody was pinging me, no one was sending me instant messages. The phone wasn't ringing. People say that I can't concentrate at work. The methods of evaluation aren't clear as well. Oftentimes, and several HR executives have told me, we've done away with job descriptions because every 2 years they change. So even the nature of the work itself is shifting. Work is highly relational. We don't work largely in hierarchical organizations anymore. And so being able to negotiate and persuade one's lateral colleagues has become a skill. There are weak time-space boundaries, right? We don't go home at 5 o'clock anymore, and if we do go home at 5 o'clock, work oftentimes follows us there. And so all of this situation is kind of conspired, and the prominent emotional tone I find is not boredom but anxiety. How do I manage all of this stuff? Right? So you might work in an organization where you have 2 different bosses, a matrix organization. Which one do you report to? Whose priorities are the ones that matter? So it's quite an interesting situation we find ourselves in. And what I find is that oftentimes people don't notice, or it becomes taken for granted. And so there are big implications for how do we make knowledge workers productive, but they're hidden in plain sight because we've largely habituated to them. Right? We accept them as the new normal. Stress is unrelenting. I can't concentrate. Oftentimes I find that my students don't realize that they can't concentrate, that these relationships require greater emotional complexity, and that there's no downtime. Even on vacation, somebody can reach me, people say. So what does this mean? Right? And these are things that don't show up. These are aspects of productivity that don't show up in a balance sheet. Right? They don't show up in a quarterly report. They're aspects of productivity that are more qualitative than they are quantitative. And I think that that has bearing on what we're going to talk about today. So let's go back to this issue of how do we make knowledge workers productive. And how we've largely made knowledge workers productive is by focusing on the external. Right? So 2 common approaches that we know are reorganizing and re-engineering work and expanding the power and reach of information technology. And it is certainly true that work reorganization or re-engineering has created enormous efficiencies that weren't there before. But the refrain that I've heard now for several years is something along the lines of, look, we've reorganized so much, there's no more fat to cut. Right? And I think we're cutting into muscle and bone. That people report we're shell-shocked and demoralized and panicked and overstressed. And how are we meant to be productive in this situation? So I think that there are limits. We're hitting the limits of what's possible with reorganization. Regarding information technology, certainly it's true. I think that our access to information is light years beyond what it was, say, even 15 years ago or 20 years ago when I was a grad student. At the risk of starting to sound like an old geezer, when I was in grad school, if you needed to get a paper, you had to go to the library, you had to go downstairs, find that particular volume, pull it off some dusty shelf, flip open the pages, carry it over to the copy machine, make photocopies, maybe cut your finger on the paper, and that may take an hour. Right, to do that whole process, to get over to the library and get all that sort of stuff. And now I can do exactly the same thing to get that information in 10 seconds. It's unbelievable. Right? It's absolutely true, I think, that information technology has, in a way, made us more productive. But we also know that information technology has its own downsides. Right? So then I start to ask, okay, are there other ways? Right? I think we will certainly continue to refine our ability to organize work and create technology that is helpful for us. I know I'm waiting for my new iPhone next week, but are there other ways? And what I'd like to suggest is maybe that there's an internal approach, and that basically asks the question, okay, rather than reorganizing our work, can we use our mind more effectively? Right? And using our mind more effectively is the province of education. But what does it mean to be educated? In our culture, modern Western culture, I think that we've largely been informed by Descartes. I think, therefore I am. Traditionally, in this culture, using our minds better has meant to learn how to think conceptually, rationally, and systematically. Right? The modern Western bias is to identify thinking with being. Right? And so education is primarily about thinking. And we've largely ignored other aspects of being human, like emotion and attention. Right? And I like to think that we've become an attention illiterate society. There are other cultures, however, that had a different starting place for what it meant to be educated. Right? And so, we go to Asia, South Asia, East Asia, and specifically Japan. There's this old Zen story of the student coming to the master and saying, "Master, can you teach me something profound?" And the master looks at the student and says, "Attention." And the student, kind of nonplussed by this, says, "Thank you, master, but can you teach me something of great, even greater wisdom?" And the master looks over and says, "Attention, attention." And the student, still not quite sure what's happening, says, "No, master, please, can you share with me your greatest wisdom?" And the master looks over and says, "Attention, attention, attention." And so you have a whole culture that is dedicated to training attention. Right? And so you have tea ceremony as a way of training attention. Calligraphy is a way of training attention. Archery is a way of training attention. Right? Sword fighting is a way of training attention. You have this culture that, in the old days, it was considered you weren't a fully developed human being unless you had one of these arts under your belt, because it was understood that it was attention that grounded you, basically, in your own reality. So let's ask the question, well, what is this attention? Right? William James, who we'll talk about in a minute, had a funny answer to this. He said, well, everybody knows what attention is. Right? Mihai Csikszentmihalyi, who is probably best known for his work on the flow experience, thought of attention as energy, as psychic energy. And that attention is the fundamental energy that we have to connect with the world internally and externally. And attention is what brings information into awareness. Right? And so we can start to think about, all right, how do we use this energy? Let's look at the extremes of how we might use this energy. One is fragmenting attention, right? Switching back and forth between things, right? Otherwise known as multitasking. Right? Now we all know that this isn't a particularly great thing to do. There's a lot of research showing that multitasking slows you down, right? It wastes time. You make more mistakes, and you manage to irritate everybody around you while you're doing it. Right? David Meyer at the University of Michigan and his colleagues, I think, did some of the first work showing this, that attention tends to make you slow and increases your rate of errors. And now there's other work showing that multitasking undermines your ability to learn something deeply. It undermines your ability to access memory. Of course, it undermines connection and relationship because everyone's irritated with you. Student after student keeps bringing me job descriptions that say must be able to multitask. And it always kind of makes me chuckle, because you would never put in your job description, must be able to do work slowly, make a lot of errors, and irritate all your colleagues, right? But that's what it does. So we live in this way of kind of fragmented attention on one side of using our attention, and then the other side is this intensely focused attention, right? Which leads to peak experiences. You can't imagine this guy suddenly pulling out his iPhone and texting his girlfriend, wondering what's for dinner that night. Right? So, I referenced Mihai Csikszentmihalyi in the flow experience earlier, but one of the core constituents or ingredients of the flow experience is the ability to focus attention. And so it's in this total state of absorption that I lose sense of myself and sense of time, where I'm pushing myself to the limit, where we feel really alive. right? And that rests in being able to focus attention. So attention fuels performance. Attention fosters connection. So one of the conversations we have in class is, what's a relationship? And what I'd like to suggest is that a relationship fundamentally boils down to exchanging attention. If there's no attention, there's no relationship. And so attention is what allows us to know ourselves and the world, and that complex mental and emotional processes can only happen with focused attention. And so attention is our capital. So one of the statements I'd like to make about productivity in a knowledge economy is that it rests on focused human attention, that the fundamental source of productive power in a knowledge economy isn't the machine and it isn't the computer, but it's focused attention. And we need to protect it. That's the medium in which things happen. That's the medium in which problems are solved and that innovation happens and that new possibilities arise. Right? So I think it's an imperative, a priority, that we learn how to protect our attention. So one of the exercises we do in class is that I suggest to my executive students, look, in the meetings where you have the authority, ban your BlackBerries. Ban BlackBerries and ban laptops and see what happens. So let me share with you a story that happened earlier in the spring. So one of my fellows, who's a C-level executive, said, okay, I'll try it. So he banned his BlackBerry, banned BlackBerries in the meeting, and he comes back and he says, well, I did it. And he said, I asked everybody to put their BlackBerries in a box outside the meeting room. And he said, man, you would have thought everybody was in rehab, like where everyone is irritable, they're all twitching, but what they started to notice is that we actually had a real conversation. And then the week after that, they came away from their BlackBerry-less meeting realizing that that it was actually quite enjoyable, that they had a satisfying encounter, and that they focused on the things that needed to be focused on. They also found that they weren't rescheduling meetings to talk about the thing in the meeting that they should have been talking about, but no one was paying attention. And over the course of the module, my student found that this 90-minute, what was originally a 90-minute meeting, turned into a 60-minute meeting. And because he had implemented this no BlackBerry policy throughout all of his meetings, he realized that he suddenly had 2 to 3 free hours a day that he didn't have before. And so let's just say 3 hours a day times 5 days a week is 15 times 4 weeks in a month is 60 hours a month that senior executive now had time to do other things with. So we'll talk a little bit more about this later, but one of the core things I'd like you to think about is, how do you protect your attention? Then we get to the de rigueur slide of every contemplative education presentation I think that's ever been given, is this quote from William James, the great American psychologist: the faculty of bringing back a wandering attention over and over again is the very root of judgment, character, and will. No one is master of himself if he has it not. An education which should improve this faculty, which would be the education par excellence. So what we learn how to do is to cultivate and manage our attention. And we learn 4 fundamental classes of contemplative practice. The first one is simply learning how to return to attention. It's managing this wandering attention, the wandering mind that James referred to. And what people are surprised to find out when they first start doing these sort of practices is that their mind is wandering all the time. Right? You sit down and you do a very basic meditation of putting your attention on an object, and for most people, they can't keep their attention on that object for more than 2 or 3 seconds. Or they're in a meeting and they start to notice they're thinking about what's for lunch. Maybe you're thinking about what's for lunch right now. It's lunchtime in Los Angeles. And so simply learning how to be present is the first kind of order of business. And so learning how to return attention to what you're doing right now develops strength and stability in attention. The second practice, or second class of practices we work with, are resetting attention. My friend Robbie Rao, who I had dinner with last night, calls this vujade. Deja vu is you go to a place that you've never been to and it seems like you've been there before. Vushade, Robbie says, is going to the place you've been to 1,000 times and being able to see it as if it's the first time. Attention reset helps you to step out of your habitual ways of perceiving and seeing the world, which then obviously creates new possibilities. Sometimes it's very funny what people will see. Somebody will report and say, my wife and I have been living at this house for more than 15 years, and I started to do this reset practice, and I pull into my driveway, and I notice there's a tree in my front yard that I've never seen before. Other times people will come in and say, I noticed I work with a colleague who is very difficult, and I'm having a meeting with this person, and I remember to do my attention reset, and I pretend as if it's the first time I've ever met this person. And he comes back and he reports, he says, it was really interesting what happened. If I stepped out of my own emotional reaction around her and actually listened to what she was saying, I realized what she was having to contribute was really valuable. And I noticed that my reaction was to more how she had said it versus what she was saying, because the way she speaks is so irritating to me. So he's sitting in this meeting imagining that it's the first time he's met this person, and he realizes she's actually she's making very valuable contributions. And at the end of that meeting, he said, it's the first time in our years of working together that I felt like we really made forward motion. And so you can start to see the implications for productivity in this case, that these two people who have to work together are now better able to work together. The third set of practices are directing attention. Right? So we direct attention towards internal events, to our thoughts, to our emotions, to our beliefs, judgments, expectations, assumptions about how things are, even to the sensations of our own bodies. Many executives I know don't pay attention to what their bodies are telling them. In fact, here's a note I received from a student who's a senior executive in her organization. It's actually incredibly moving. She says, first of all, it's shocking to me how totally unaware I've been of my physical reactions to things. Clueless would be a good word, or disconnected, oblivious. It's pretty hard for me to admit this, as I like to think of myself as a very aware and attuned to my physical body. I work hard to keep it fit and strong, and yet I'm so unaware of my physiological reactions. In my meditation exercises, it's been a struggle to observe my physical responses. Am I stressed? Are my muscles tight? Not sure. I think I'm used to feeling this way, so I don't recognize it. It's been a way of life. I've always managed it by running and exercising and eating healthy. But I think the meditation exercises are opportunities for me to look at things in a different way. I'm wondering now if the significant diagnoses in my life relate to being so physically unaware. I was diagnosed with breast cancer at age 36. I was diagnosed with a melanoma at age 42. About 6 years ago, I was diagnosed with Crohn's disease, an inflammatory bowel disease. It's part of the autoimmune family of diseases. And in February of this year, I was diagnosed with an autoimmune arthritis that's related to Crohn's disease. I woke up one morning and my hands and wrists and elbows really hurt. And I thought it was because of 7 days of hard downhill skiing. It wasn't. This last one has been particularly difficult for me to just write off as bad luck. I thought of arthritis as something you get when you're 80, not when you're in your 50s and very physically active. The light is beginning to go on that I need a new way to manage my life. And maybe sitting, resting on my breath is just what I need. A story like that is one that comes across my desk a lot. I think that when we're in the mode of getting things done, a common refrain I hear from students is that I power through. I'm just pushing through what I need to do. And oftentimes, it's at the expense of one's own body and health. The fourth set of practices. So I should say, back to this one, directing attention is where mindfulness comes in. Right? Mindfulness is learning how to direct your attention to what's going on inside you. Right? And there are several other ways we use a directed attention practice that are similar to mindfulness, but but a bit different. One is to learn how to diffuse difficult emotions so that your mind can be clear when you take action. And there's another permutation which allows you to solve problems that you're stuck on. So we learn about 6 to 8 different contemplative practices in the process of these 21 weeks. The final set are a series that transform attention, and attention transformation practices are there to cultivate energy. They address the mind's natural tendency towards negativity bias. You know, our natural habit of seeing what's bad or what's wrong or what's broken. And we start to shift attention to see, well, okay, there's stuff that's bad and broken and wrong, but what's going well? And what's going right? Because we can over-focus on what's going wrong, and we start to lose the larger picture of what's actually happening. Excuse me. For me, this was particularly instructive. You know, I had kidney disease for 17 years, and at one point, and when you're living with chronic illness, it's very easy to create a story about being a sick person. And at some point, I realized that there was actually only one part of me that was sick, that the rest of me was actually really healthy. And having that insight gave me a lot of energy to keep going forward, because I wasn't mired in the difficulty or sadness of having this one part, and albeit a very important part, go wrong. But it helped me to see a much larger picture and to still be more productive, still, you know, be active and productive in that process. So we're working with attention, right? And we come back, we start with William James and we end with Peter Drucker. And nearly a century after James's insight, Drucker writes, Descartes said, "I think, therefore I am." But we'll also have to say, "I see, therefore I am." And since Descartes, the accent has been primarily the accent on education, right? The accent has been on the conceptual. Increasingly, we'll balance the conceptual with the perceptual. And this will become the archetype of the educated person. So Drucker understood that we also had to train attention. Okay, so why? One of the big Drucker themes is how do we adapt to change? A theme that he would visit over and over again, is that this particular time in human history is one of enormous change. And for Drucker, the issue of cultivating perception was to be able to see the world clearly, and so that we could adapt to what's actually happening. Okay, so well, why is that such a hard thing to do? If you want to read a really fantastic book, this book, Strangers to Ourselves, Discovering the Adaptive Unconscious by Timothy Wilson, who's at the University of Virginia, outlines exactly how the mind works, or some aspects of the mind that work that we basically have ignored, more or less, in organizational and managerial life. One is the limited capacity of attention, that we have a bottleneck in terms of the amount of attention we have to use. The nervous system can assimilate about 11 million bits of information per second, okay? So 11 million bits of information per second. Now, question for you. Take a guess. How much of that 11 million bits do you think we're consciously aware of? Okay, so just type in your answer. Let's see what you got. So these are great. From 1 million to 3 to 5%, go long. 1 million, all right. Okay, here's the answer. It's 40, right? So we have 40 minutes, or we have 40 bits of information to work with, right? Conscious awareness is extremely limited. The other issue is that we operate, because conscious awareness is extremely limited, we largely operate on automatic pilot. And the big issue with that is that these habits and patterns learn faster than they unlearn, right? And so Drucker talked about the importance of learning how to unlearn. Why? Because in a changing map, in a changing world, the maps become outdated. We don't have Microsoft software auto-update feature, right? That we had to train perception to be able to see the changing reality to be able to be more effective. Now, one habit that I think we're still in the midst of working with is this old industrial holdover that we have with controlling time. And maximizing time, I think, is something that we're always trying to do. But the issue is that we don't control time, right? We control attention. And a student of mine talked about this a couple of weeks ago. She walks in. She's a very successful person, working in a startup environment, but also very frustrated about what she's not able to get done. She goes into her office the next day after class with this idea of looking at attention, and she realizes that the copy machine is right next to her door, and that while people are waiting for their copies, they talk to her, and they interrupt her flow of thought, so she can't get into deeper states of concentration. Instantly, the copy machine is moved over to the other side of the room, and she's able to concentrate and do her work. So we talk about these old assumptions, and that attention wasn't even on her radar screen. So she got better results when she started to pay attention to her attention. And the purpose, in Drucker's point of view, of management is to get a result, right? It's nothing particularly mystical, but then we have to start to ask ourselves, where do results come from, right? And what are the kinds of results we want? I like to say that there are two kinds of results. It's a bit simplistic, but it works for our purposes. That they're the results you want and the results you don't want, right? So where do results come from? You have a result, right? The result comes from an action you take, which is informed by the choices you have, which the choices themselves are informed by conscious awareness. The conscious awareness is driven by the attention that we give, right? So we look at a particular kind of result, the repeated unwanted result, which suggests to you that there's something wrong with the map, right? That the repeated unwanted result comes from some kind of habitual action, which means we've made a mindless choice, which is informed by a lack of conscious awareness, which is itself informed by a lack of attention. A student of mine wrote, "I'm aware that most of my days are spent on automatic pilot, absent-mindedly doing the same things, reacting the same way to the same stimuli, and struggling with the same issues over and over again." How do we start to shift this? How do we get the result we want? We cultivate attention. That enhances our awareness. It expands our sense of what's possible, the choices that we have. Right? And we're able to take a more deliberate action, right? Which then gets us the result we want. A quick example from a student of mine, again, a C-level executive. In the past, I may have seen a roadblock, and the only option was to turn around or drive right through it. Now I see a detour with many options, not just a one-dimensional roadblock. I see the detours with enough clarity to understand the pros and cons of each and to allow myself the opportunity to make the best choice to move forward. Right? So we cultivate attention to create choices. We cultivate attention, we focus attention to be productive and get things done, but there's another aspect that attention helps us with too. We cultivate attention to create choices. We create choices by learning how to step out of the old ways of seeing, acting, feeling, and relating. Right? We go back to this issue of what does it mean to make knowledge workers productive. Productivity is about getting something done. And I start to realize we have to expand our notion of what it means to be productive to something I like to call generativity, which is creating choices and possibilities. That we've traditionally applied knowledge to work process, and that we have to begin to apply knowledge to ourselves. In the old days, before the Industrial Revolution, knowledge was applied to being. Right? So we cultivated ourselves. The Industrial Revolution happened. We apply knowledge to doing. We create steam engines and railroads and airplanes and computers. But now I think we've pushed the limit of that, and that the arrow has to come back around. In order for us to do better, we have to be better, in a sense. Drucker in 1959 wrote this, that society needs to return to spiritual values, not to offset the material, but to make it fully productive. And I think we can think of spiritual in the broad sense of cultivating internal qualities to manage our own darkness and to cultivate our compassionate, better selves. And to close, he said if it fails, if we fail to solve these problems, then not only will we be in a dark age without stars even to light up the night, but if we succeed at doing this, in solving these problems, it could be one of the greatest eras of man. That's what I have to say today. Why don't we move to questions? If you want to know more about the Drucker School or the Drucker Institute or even me, here's the contact information. So, love to hear your question.
Thanks, Jeremy. Let's leave that slide up for a while, and you can take a look at the questions.
Sure.
I also there were some other publications that you mentioned, the books, and we can post those titles and information about Timothy Wilson's book and about the Peter Drucker volumes along with the webinar when we do that, just in case people are wanting those resources. You don't need to ask Jeremy for those, but
Sure.
We'll post those with the webinar. And I really, really enjoyed that presentation, which I think was the result of quite a wonderful, refined awareness and the choices you made.
I have a really great graphic designer. So.
Yeah, and a great graphic designer, right. So yeah, powerful rationale for our need to really build our capacity for attention and how valuable that really is. So I hope you've been able to open up the questions pane to see if there are something there that you'd like to address. And technically we are at the point where we're about to end the webinar, but I'm going to ask people if they'd be willing to stay a bit longer so you can address some questions with the understanding that if you do need to skip off, that this is the amount of time that we agreed to control of your attention and time. All right.
We will return your attention to you. So let's see here. I can see part of the question. Do you see mindfulness emerging more widely as a leading tool in advancing leadership training? Yes, I hope. My friend Michael Chaskelson and I are right now co-authoring a paper on the relationship between leadership and mindfulness. But I think it is we're certainly on the cusp of that. Other questions? Let's see. Do you recommend cultivating a skill like archery to gain the ability to attend? Yes, I mean, you can do anything. Golf. My Japanese students use their golf practice as a meditation, and they won the Drucker golf tournament a few years ago. Let's see. First function, thank you. Yes, thank you. Let's see. Can we really change systems and environments by changing ourselves? Nancy, that's a really fantastic question. There is the yes and no, right? I was thinking about this yesterday. Cultivating the capacity of attention in oneself, I think, helps to see not only my own stuff, but you're also able to see other people's stuff, right? So one of the things that happens in class is that suddenly students become aware of how mindless everybody is, right? Whereas 7 weeks before, no one ever noticed. Now, but operating at the level of system, I think, is different, and that there are other methods that can be brought to bear. But I think first, one which I learned from Ken MacLeod himself, who I think is on this webinar, is from Barry Oshery and seeing powers, seeing systems. And that, thinking at a systems level is very different, of course, than thinking at a personal level. But I think it's also essential that we can't change the systems level without first having disciplining ourselves as well. So that's a quick answer to a very complex question, which I really appreciate. How do I bring mindfulness practice to others in my organization in an accessible way, especially if they're closed to contemplative practice? Yes, absolutely. One of the things we talk about in class is that you do not want to become a mindfulness missionary, because that not only does it make you kind of a pain in the neck, it tends to ruin Thanksgiving dinner. I think that one is by learning the first and most important mission is learning how to manage oneself. And if evidence from my students is any example, they would say things like, I notice that as I'm calmer, they become calmer. If I ask them more thoughtful questions or questions that open things up rather than shut things down, they start to ask questions that open things up rather than shut things down. So it's much more subtle and than giving a presentation. But I think it always starts with oneself, basically. Let's see. Have you found the work of Rudolf Steiner helpful to your work? I only know a little bit about Rudolf Steiner. My friend Arthur Zients at Amherst knows a lot more about Rudolf Steiner, and he's on the list for me to call so that I can learn more. So that's all I can tell you at this moment. How do you retrain attention from industrial work to knowledge work? Say more about that, Daniel. I'm not sure what you want.
So Jeremy, yeah, if you want to just maybe take up one additional question, and if Dan has a chance to clarify, then we could maybe call it there.
Yeah. Meg says, I teach mindfulness in corporations, and there's a question about calling it a mindfulness program or something like the practice of self-management, which perhaps reflects a deeper understanding and goal. Your thoughts on the future and what's effective. For many years, I didn't use the word mindfulness, Meg, partially because I think it's not such a common word. Now, these days, I think the world is changing. I generally try to talk about it in terms of attention training, which still might, I think, seem more accessible to people. I try to go out of my way to make sure things don't seem weird. Because we're so used to training rationality that when we start to train perception, we experience it as something very strange. So I don't know if that helps, but I think that we're starting to get attention in a way. I'm not, and maybe we're starting to get mindfulness too. There's a whole. Right now, even as we speak, I think in New York is the Mindful Society program.
This weekend, yeah. Yeah,
this weekend. So that's my quick answer to that. Now, of course, I'm happy to talk to people later. I have an employee who I advance her to executive manager. She's a meditator, but still focused on the external result rather than thinking like an executive. So that's basic management training. She needs to shift out of her own habits. So, looking at larger strategies versus, her old habit. That may be less of an issue around mindfulness and more an issue around management training and expectation.
There are a lot of wonderful questions there, and we can also forward those to you, and, if people have a chance to, contact you, I think that that's a possibility. You've given your contact information very generously. And I just want to thank everyone for joining us today. It was a very illuminating look at the value of attention and what it means in this kind of a human capital way. Thanks to everyone who attended. Thanks to you, Jeremy.
Thank you.
Yeah, it was really a pleasure. And sorry for the little hiccups along the way, but I think things smoothed out, and we really were able to get out a lot out of the presentation. So our next webinar is a bit up in the air, but the plans are in process, and so we'll post it to the website just as soon as we have the details available, and send out an email to you all with more information. So I hope you'll be able to join us later this year for another exploration of contemplative practice in the higher education domains. But for now, farewell until we meet again.